So I had an interesting thought today. If the female-male pay gap is something like 75 cents, so for every dollar that a man earns, a woman only earns 75 cents, and then the racial gap increases that, so a black woman only earns like 67 cents for everything that a white man earns. What is the household pet pay gap? I want to know, because household pets, they earn very little. They aren't actually compensated in dollars. They're usually compensated in terms of food and shelter. And if you think about the shelter of household pets, it's not that great. You got the dog house, you've got the garage perhaps. Most pets, they don't have their own bedrooms, they don't have their own laundry rooms or bathrooms, they don't have a lot of privacy. So if you had to calculate that as a rent, they would be getting very low compensation in the form of room and board. And you look at the food that they get, it's very consistent, there's no variation, it's usually not organic. So you look at the food that they're getting, it's not that great. And so you look at how much do pets earn per year? We could just do like a simple calculation. Let's say it costs, pet food costs $10 a day or something. I'm sure it costs less than that. But let's just assume $10 a day, it's what, 3,000, like $3,000 a year that pets are receiving in compensation. Now pets, it's not like they do less than us. In fact, the housewife works harder than the man who goes to a job, who goes to the office. The housewife, according to the labor theory of value, the housewife should be paid more than the man who goes to the office. And black people work harder than white people because they have to overcome white supremacy. So, when we're looking at this, really, pets live shorter lives than human beings, and therefore, that's another reason why they should probably be compensated more. So we should not be spending $3,000 a year on our pets. We should be spending $30,000 a year on our pets. And if you're not spending $30,000 a year on pets, then you are perpetuating this owner supremacy, this humanist supremacy over your pets. And that's the reason why pets score so low on the SATs, the ACTs. That's why their college acceptance rates are lower. That's why their debt is higher. Household wealth for pets is lower than that of humanoids. So, the pet problems, pet crime, pet domestic violence, pet-on-pet crime is high, not because pets are inherently violent and uncivilized, but pet-on-pet crime is high because of owner supremacy, because of the restricted access to education, because of systematic discrimination. So we could talk about this, and I hope people wouldn't misrepresent what I'm doing now, because a lot of people would say, they would get it the opposite. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take the obvious plight of women and blacks, and I'm trying to extend your sympathy further to understand the plight of pets. But a lot of people would misunderstand it, and they would get it all backwards, and they would think that I'm comparing women and black people to animals, which is something I would never do. But that does bring up an interesting philosophical point of contention, this concept of dehumanization, which is a very 20th century and 21st century word. It's a very modern and even a postmodern term. We have to really understand what it means to dehumanize and the entire moral framework that goes behind a term like dehumanization. What does it mean? Well, to dehumanize basically is to take a person or a group of people and to look at them objectively without applying a sacred frame, without applying thumotic distortions. So a thumotic distortion, I'll give you an example, is, I have a family, or I have my friends, or I have people that I'm close to, and if you hurt these people, I'm going to be much more concerned about the pain and suffering you've caused to the people who are close to me than if you were to cause pain and suffering to people over in Africa. And this thumotic attachment and thumotic distortion is not a bad thing. It's not a negative thing, because I, as a person, and maybe you could say in a Heideggerian sense, I, as a person in my being, I am restricted to a certain time and place. I can't be everywhere at once. I'm not God. And so because I can't be everywhere at once, I therefore can only attend to problems which are proximate to me. Furthermore, it's not just about geographic proximity, but it's also about cultural proximity. I cannot fix the problems of the Islamic community. I cannot fix the problems of the Jewish community. I can't fix the problems of the black community or the Hispanic community. If I'm not part of that community, if I'm not from within the community, any attempt of me to externally change those communities is not going to be successful in itself unless I have a connection to someone within the community. Then I can work with them theoretically to change that community. But there's an old saying that basically you can't force people to change. They have to want to change. You know, if you look at someone, for instance, you could, as a woman, you could see a man who is troubled, a troubled man, and a lot of women say things like, "I want to save him," like he's a dangerous criminal. There were a lot of love letters that were sent to Jeffrey Dahmer, and I'm thinking of another one. Let's see, serial killer lawyer. And that's going to bring up the guy who I'm really thinking about, Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy got a lot of love letters. And the mentality of these women was, I just want to save Ted Bundy. I just want to, you know, he seems like a dark and troubled soul, and they're attracted to that. And that's part of their mother morality that instinctively tells them you have to save, you know, this weak and troubled man, or he's like a dark, stormy, dark triad sociopath, and they're attracted to that. But men have another concept, which is white knighting, and so they see a woman who's a bit messed up, and they want to save her, right? And this is very unfortunate, because in the case where you have a man who says, I want to save a woman, and then maybe he marries the woman in order to save her, and he has children with her in order to save the woman, and now he has children with this woman, but the problem is he hasn't saved her, right? Whatever her problems are, whether it's she's sociopathic, she could be bipolar. I mean, there's so many different things that can go wrong with the human mind that I could never run out of maladies to describe. But in any case, he might find he hasn't saved her, and now he has children with her, and now she's abusing the children, and now she's divorcing him, and now she's accusing him of rape and all these other things. And so she's basically taken his children hostage, and she's abusing the children, and he can't do anything about it. So this desire to want to save people, to change people, is very dangerous. Ultimately, change has to come from within most of the time. There's an old saying about when we talk about a master and an apprentice in an occult school, there's a concept that the apprentice has to seek out the master, and the master will not appear until the student is ready. Now that's that mystery school, sort of going back to the ancient Greeks and Egyptians. That's something that is even present within Christianity, in terms of you have to be willing to seek out God. God's not going to force himself into your life. You have to be open to him. And then, of course, there's the Jewish conception of conversion, where Jews don't seek out converts. Rather, if someone tries to convert to Judaism, they reject him. I think it's 3 or 5 times or something. Anyway, you're supposed to reject them a number of times before you finally accept them and start training them for conversion to Judaism. So this concept of you can't change people from the outside, they have to change from the inside. It's a concept that you find in a lot of different contexts across the spectrum. So, you know, this concept of you can't change people from outside, you have to change people from inside, doesn't just apply to the individual, but it also applies to groups. And so when we talk about this thumotic connection that we have to different groups. So I have a thumotic connection to people who look like me. So I have a thumotic connection to men. I have a thumotic connection to people of a Caucasoid appearance, and the more and more people verge in on an extreme, like Nordic appearance, with the blonde hair, the blue eyes, a symmetrical face, all those features, and then my thumotic attachment increases. Now, some of that is universal. I mean, if you look at white women as a sex object, are universally appraised as desirable. So it doesn't matter whether you go to Africa or India or China or South America, really anywhere you are in the world, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman with a symmetrical face and typical Nordic features is going to be sexually desirable. For men, it's a little bit of a different story. I don't know. There haven't been as much. I haven't seen the data for gay men if the Nordic male is as sexually attractive to gay men as white women are to heterosexual men of all races. But so there's a thumotic attachment there in a universal sense of everyone is attracted to these features. I mean, there have been tons of studies done on black children. They prefer the white dolls rather than the black dolls in a lot of cases. And, some of that might be nature, some of it might be nurture. It's hard to untangle, but regardless, there is a thumotic attachment. And some of that is perhaps due to an overall structure of white supremacy. Some of it's just due to the narcissistic nature of in-group identification, that we identify with people who look like ourselves, genetic sexual attraction, so on and so forth. So I have my own thumotic attachments, and that mechanism of preferring people and caring more about people who are more like myself means my efforts are going to be more effective. If you spend all your time trying to fix the black community as a white person, you're not going to be very effective because, again, change usually has to come from within. You can't force people to change. Or if you do try to force people to change, it's usually something that ends in violence or extermination. That's a very harsh process. It doesn't usually go over so well. And sometimes you try to force change on people, and it just ends up reversing. So you try to forcibly Christianize a population, and then it goes back into, demon worship and voodoo and all that. Haiti is a great example of this. I think this human mechanism of our psychology, where we seek out people who are like ourselves, who are proximate to ourselves, not just quantitatively in terms of the distance traveled, that proximity, but also our proximate qualities. How close are they to us, not geographically, but in their qualities? Are they fellow men? Are they fellow... I almost said the meme. I didn't say the meme. Are they fellow members of our race or whatever? And there are different levels to that, right? So someone can... and this is the thing. I guess the problem that people have with Jews is that Jews seemingly would fit into the Caucasoid family of people. So you've got Russians, you've got Sicilians, you've got Irishmen, and there's a lot of difference between them, but ultimately we can say, oh, this is a Caucasoid people, and they can all be lumped together in terms of American race relations. But then the Jews have always kind of been outside that. The Irish, to an extent, if you look at voting patterns and historical, Irish animus against the English. The Irish have tried to distinguish themselves and say, we're not white, we're Irish because we weren't considered white, and blah, blah, blah. And some of that is folklore and some of that is mythology. But, the Jews have done it to a different extent, where they're really insistent on saying, and it's reinforced on both sides. Jews will say, I'm not white, I'm Jewish. And then you have, white advocates who will say, you're not white, you're Jewish. And it goes back and forth. And so it's a very interesting thing that genetically it might not be admissible, or you might not be able to support that position on a genetic level, but mimetically, culturally, how people identify, that's an important thing. So, we can talk about nested identities, how someone might say, well, first of all, I identify as an Irish American or whatever it may be. And then after that, I identify with white Americans. And then after that, I identify with vaguely Christian conservative Americans, and then, you know, so on and so forth and outward. You know, my idea here is that traditionally, due to the limits of transportation and the limits of communication, the sort of natural expression of these nested identities ended up forming a political scenario in which you might have a identity of your city, so you're from Munich, and then you have an identity with your province or your region, so you're from Bavaria, and then you have an identity with your nation state, so you're a German, then you have an identity with your continent or your race, and that's European. But today we're in a situation, because of the mass migrations of peoples all over the world, and because of the instantaneous and free and basically cost-free mechanism of internet communication, a lot of those barriers have broken down, and so these nested identities don't so neatly inscribe themselves within physical geographical boundaries anymore. So we can't just say, okay, Munich, Bavaria, Germany, Europe, and so on and so forth. Instead, it's more like you might have an internet group that is, okay, we are, you know, the AfD of Munich, and we have things in common with this Italian conservative, you know, the Five-Star movement in Italy, and we both speak English because that's the second language of pretty much everyone. That's the lingua franca. And so, you know, a German living in Munich might have more in common with an Italian living in Venice or wherever the Five-Star movement's popular. I don't know, Lombardy or wherever it is. They might form a friendship, and they might form a working relationship. Now, this is how academics has worked for a while. Academics for the last century has been extremely transnational. And even, again, you go back to my Rudolf II video and look at the people who he patronized, who he gave patronage to, I should say. He gave patronage to these key figures and the budding science of astronomy, which of course has roots in astrology. But you look at a lot of the different people, from Galileo to Copernicus, and some of these different figures, Tycho Brahe. I can't get over that. I was taught for so many years it was Brahe, but apparently it's Brahe. But you look at a lot of these figures, and they're interconnected, and they build off each other. But there was, you know, a transnationalist component to that. You see this with music. You see it all over the place. Now, up to the point, I'll give you another example of Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton and Leibniz, Gottfried Leibniz, they both claim to have invented the calculus independently. And it's possible that they both did. But communication at that time was slow enough that it's still in dispute. Some people still say it was Newton. Some people say it was Leibniz. But communication was slow enough at that time. Today, communication is so instantaneous that, again, I can have more in common and more qualitative proximity, not quantitative, not in terms of the distance traveled, but I can have more qualitative proximity to someone living, you know, half a world away, and who grew up in a different country, in a different nation state, different political system, everything. So, you know, the academic world has been acclimated to this truth for a while, and the rest of us have been catching up. So yeah, academia has been on this track for a while. If you get into academics or mainstream academics, you see that you know, a lot of research papers that come out of Japan are in English. In Italy, they're speaking English. In China, wherever these academic papers are being published, especially in science, they're going to be in English. And these working relationships and people who come together in research teams are doing so transnationally. You don't even have to travel. You can just use Skype to talk to one another and create a research paper together from completely different sides of the world. So, you know, this kind of international cooperation, I think, is a very powerful thing, and it allows for a great degree of specialization. If I was confined to walking around my neighborhood and knocking on doors and saying, hey, would you like to watch my YouTube videos? I think my views would be very low. But because I have access to a whole host of countries around the world, I have a lot more viewership. And in fact, some of my top commenters are people who are very far away from me. So, quantitatively, in our geographical distance, there's a great distinction between us, but qualitatively, a lot of our interests overlap. So that is the thematic predilection or the thematic connection that you have people. How close you are to people changes how we view people. We don't view people as robots. We don't view people as animals to the extent that we have a thematic connection to them. When we have a thematic connection, that the sociopathy or the objectivism of just seeing people as a statistic, that is overpowered by our emotion. That person is no longer, a complex animal, but the person has a soul. And so, our ability to empathize with people and to view them as ourselves, that has been described as humanizing, when we humanize something or humanize someone. But I'm not sure humanizing is the right word, because again, when we talk about pets, someone can have a close connection to an animal, and they're not necessarily humanizing the animal. And now maybe that is what's going on. Maybe on a neurological level, if we looked at a brain scan, we would say that, when a person has a close connection to a pet, they actually, the part of their brain that is used to distinguish humans from animals, if there is such a thing, I don't know enough. I don't even know if the research is out there somewhere, but I certainly don't know either way. But it's perhaps correct that I'm incorrect. It's perhaps the case that humanization is really the best word. But I think about it in a more general sense of, it's not necessarily that we humanize animals, but we form a thematic connection with them. And we can do this with all kinds of things. We can form a thematic connection with the video games. Whenever you feel close to something, you feel familiar to something, and you feel as if that thing is a part of yourself. Oh, this video game is a part of myself, or this sport is a part of myself. That is, to my mind, that is a thematic connection. And the broad, general scope of what I'm saying is that people form thematic connections not just with other people, but with all kinds of things. They form thematic connections with their coin collection, and they form thematic connections with their train sets, and they form thematic connection with their car, their motorcycle, and their boats. Sailors have been anthropomorphizing boats for a very long time. So this ability for human beings to form thematic connections with non-humans is well attested. And we've even been doing it with our organs, saying like our heart is healthy, or the heart is happy, or the heart is sad. Greeks would look at organs and they would say, well, the heart is the seat of your emotion, your thumos, which makes a lot of sense, because if you look at diagrams of the parts of the body that heat up when you feel emotion, it's your core centered on your heart. So actually it does make a lot of sense that the Greeks would have guessed that, even if they're technically incorrect. Yeah, I mean, we can anthropomorphize, and we can form these thematic attachments. But the thumos is something that we add upon. We, as a subject, we apply that thematic connection to things. It is not as if they inherently have the quality of familiarity absent our subjectivity. So, for other people, this is also the case, that other people do not have a value unless someone or something values them. Now, the first valuation is not of other people on yourself. It's yourself to yourself. It is viewing yourself in the third person. I want to preserve my life. I want to preserve my health. I want to preserve my brain and my heart and my body. I want to preserve my mental health. I want to preserve my spiritual health. So I evaluate myself. I form a thumatic connection with myself. That is sort of the first will, that Schopenhauer talks about, the will of life to perpetuate itself, to love itself, to value itself. That's the first thing that we do. And then other people come along, and they, through the process of empathy, the collectivizing empathy, through the process or the mechanism of this evolution of the selfish gene selects for this behavior where we take our initial thumatic appraisal of ourselves, we value ourselves, and then we empathetically, through the mirror neurons, which, that's a kind of pseudoscience, but that's the popular language, the popular science. We use the mirror neurons to view each other as being like ourselves, and we extend the thumatic connection primary to ourselves. We extend that outward to others, but we do so along a gradient of how close that person is to ourselves. Now, for women, this is different because women have a huge thumatic connection to infants and to babies and to weaklings. And so a woman isn't looking for people who are like herself. A woman is looking for people who are infant-like, childlike, helpless. And that's why, whereas men have a huge thumatic connection, we appraise ourselves, we value, and we identify with our strengths. Very few people go around saying, I'm really bad at this, and that's how I define myself. No, people define themselves by their strengths. If I say, who are you? Someone will say, well, I'm a gamer. Why are you a gamer? Because you're good at playing video games. I'm a chess player. Why are you a chess player? Because you're good at playing chess. I'm a bodybuilder. Why are you a bodybuilder? Because I'm good at bodybuilding. So the way that people define themselves often has to do with what their strengths are. And so if I value or I admire someone, let's say I admire Arnold Schwarzenegger because he's big and strong and tough and he works hard. Well, the reason why I admire Arnold Schwarzenegger is because I believe that he is an ideal form, or he is an extension, or he is an expression of what I value within myself. So within myself, I like when I work hard. I like when I succeed. I like these things about myself. That's how I'd like to think about myself. Even if I have low self-esteem, even if I hate myself, whatever, all those things beside the point, the things that I like in myself, I'm then going to like in other people. If I do not identify with my own strength, if I don't identify with my body, I might think, Arnold Schwarzenegger is a bloated sociopath, he's a politician, he's just out here to get attention, he's a narcissist. And so I could have a very different appraisal of Arnold Schwarzenegger. But ultimately, the degree to which we admire people is the degree to which we think they are a better representation of ourselves than we ourselves have actualized. So they are a better representation of our ideal self than our current self is of our ideal self. So there's that distinction between the ideal self and the actualized self, which is where you get the phrase, become who you are. You become who you are, in this case, the who here. Who are you? Well, you are your idealized self in this framework. So to become who you really are means to actualize the idealized self rather than to be content with your current actualization, which is distinct from your idealization. All of this is to say that clearly we have different thumatic attachments, not only to other people, but to aspects of ourselves. We like to highlight or we like to hide different aspects of ourselves depending on how we appraise those aspects. So clearly, this whole question of dehumanization versus humanization, I think that paradigm and that structure or that spectrum has to be subordinate to a greater structure, which is the thematic structure, the way that we identify with different aspects within ourselves, and then we extend that identification to other people. So if you like something about yourself, you idealize or you admire people who take that quality to the next level. If you don't like something about yourself, like let's say you have self-doubt. Everyone has self-doubt, right? And you see someone who's very unconfident, you might not like that person. You might find that person annoying, or you might find them... there are many different slurs for people who are not confident, people who are afraid, people who are cowardly, and so on and so forth. Often, what people hate most or fear most in other people is what pertains most to their greatest weakness or their greatest perceived weakness. So, I would be afraid to interact with people who I feel represent my greatest weakness, whatever flaw that might be. So someone who, as an example, someone who is afraid of being violent would despise violent people. Not because he's necessarily the opposite of a violent person, but because he fears his own internal violence. He despises his own internal violence. Maybe violence isn't such a good term to use, but we all get disgusted when we see a fat person, eating food sloppily. And perhaps different people might have different reactions. Some people might think it's funny, some people might think it's disgusting. But I think there is an aspect there that the consumptive act, we're disgusted by it because we identify it within ourselves. And we view that person as a representation of our own worst aspects. And so we look at that person, and it's almost as if we're seeing a mirror into our own souls, and we're saying, oh my gosh, I also have engaged in acts of consumption, this grotesque engorgement, this solipsistic fulfillment, and it's really disgusting, and you start to hate the other person. Really, you're not hating the other person as being opposite to you. You're hating the person as an extension of your own self-hatred. All of this is really to say that, again, the question of dehumanization versus humanization, it's centered on this question of humanism. And humanism holds that every individual is equal, and we're all equal before God, and we're all created equal. And I've described previously how that doctrine is ultimately a meritocratic doctrine. There is a meritocracy implicit within the idea that all men are created equal. And if you never have an element of meritocracy, you always degenerate into an aristocracy that has no ability whatsoever, has no discernment. I mean, there is always a regression to the mean. There is always the entropic principle, which takes the best bloodline and always degrades it and takes it down to the level of the average man. And then you have people who are totally incompetent and unfit to rule. You have inbred rulers who are less mentally well off, or they're not as sane as the average person off the street. Mad King George, that sort of thing. So there's obviously an aspect of truth to that, the idea that all men are created equal. But if you then take it to the opposite extreme, when you say that all people are equal and therefore we must have an equal thumotic attachment to every individual, well, that's not just contrary to how we perceive other people, but it's contrary to how we perceive ourselves, how we evaluate ourselves. If every person is equal, then that destroys the whole concept of qualification. And if we can't qualify other people, then we can't qualify ourselves. And that's why the equality movement ultimately is pushing more and more this self-acceptance, self-love. Why is it that these radical egalitarians are pushing self-love? Because they know that the more you struggle against yourself, the more you try to increase what is good in yourself and decrease that which is bad, the more you qualify yourself, the more you judge yourself, the more judgmental you will be of other people. And so they correctly believe that judgment starts within. That if you judge yourself, you will also judge other people. And so they're trying to breed people. It's a psychotic cultic experiment. It's very strange, and it's designed as an ideology to destroy you and to attack you on a fundamental level. And I think everyone can recognize this, pagan, Christian, atheist, doesn't matter who you are. Everyone understands that trying dogmatically to call the process of discernment, they call it discrimination, but the process of discernment, and the term judgment and judgmental has become a negative term, when actually being a judge is one of the most holy professions that you could ever aspire to. Being a judge. I mean, the judges of Israel, a judge in the court system, I mean, that's an important job. The ability to discern right from wrong, that's so important. And it starts with you. It starts with you looking at yourself, that process of self-evaluation, examining your own life and saying, okay, what are my strengths? What are your weaknesses? But the people who hate you and want to destroy you are telling you to love yourself unequivocally. You just have to love yourself, and you just have to, or I shouldn't even say unequivocally, I should say equivocally. It's a weird semantic contradiction there, but or an what is it? An oxymoron. The point is that they want you to love every. If you're fat, I guess I could call them anti-white, but I mean I could call them anti-male, but it goes beyond that. It goes beyond that. These people hold power. The people who control the media, they are the powerful elite. They hold the monopoly of power. And they want everyone else to destroy themselves. Black, white, male, female. It doesn't matter who you are. The people who are in power want everyone to degrade themselves. And so they're pushing the fat acceptance movement. They're pushing it on white people. But they're pushing it on everyone. They want everyone to believe they're perfect just the way they are. And the reason why I oppose that is because it's symbolic of the whole moral superstructure. This mother morality, this feminine morality, where you say it is better to be disabled. It is better to be less privileged. It is better to be less successful. It is better to be more of a failure. It is better, like they'll just keep listing all of these things, that it's better to be worse off than it is to be better off. This constant inversion, and that appeals to a mother sense of always trying to find the weakest member of society and nurse it and nurture it and give it resources. That is the mother morality, but they're forcing that on everyone, and they're trying to make people into their own mothers. This self-love, self-care, it's a very sick movement. It's a very solipsistic movement where you're always concerned with nursing your own weaknesses and praising yourself for your own weaknesses. So I'm fat, and therefore I love myself. I love my fat rolls. It's so beautiful. And they're trying to force people. It's very Orwellian. Of course, Orwell was part of the movement to make this thing become a reality. He and his anti-fascism helped make this a reality. But it's a very strange, just again, the semantics of the situation of people. They're like, well, let's restructure our entire morality and our entire perception of the world so that fat people love themselves rather than just lose some weight, rather than just stop eating so much food. I mean, is that so hard? I mean, there's starving children in Africa, so I mean, you would think the moral thing to do would be to eat less food so there's more food to give to the starving children in Africa, but they're like, no, we should reshape our entire moral code, our entire standard of beauty, so that fat people can feel okay with themselves. And I'm saying, no, this is just a very visceral and it's ultimately a superficial example, because I think there are plenty of people who could be overweight who could be perfectly moral people. Like, I'm not saying that if you're fat, you are necessarily an evil person, and if you're skinny, you're necessarily a good person. But it's a visual representation, and it's ridiculous, right? And people can understand that because people are very visual, and so you can look at a fat person, you understand instinctually this is disgusting. But they do it on a more insidious level with other things like sexuality, with things like race. They do it in so many ways where they'll say that we need to change, we need to stop having a European beauty standard. Well, the European beauty standard created the modern world for us to even get to this point where we can start questioning our most basic morality. And maybe that's a problem with European people, that we are so critical, and we are so open to criticism, and we're so open to change and evolution. That's something that goes back to the Indo-Europeans. The fact that we're so universalistic and open-minded, perhaps that's a problem. That's what's led us to this point. But yeah, the questioning of everything and saying that it's better to change your perception so that it fits reality rather than changing reality to fit your perception. Like, we perceive things to be ugly, so let's change. Like, we perceive trash in the street to be ugly, so let's clean up the trash rather than redefining trash as ornamentation. That's my basic message. And that's my basic moral contention and the problem that we have. And you have an elite that wants to make the world ugly so that your soul withers and dies, so that you don't resist their plans, and so you're not an obstacle to them, you're not a threat to them. They want to make people infantile. They want to make people, they want to create a mother-infant dialectic within the individual so that you are your own mother and you are your own baby at the same time, and you're like wearing diapers and you're masturbating. That's the kind of state they want you to get in. They don't want you to be the kind of person who says, you know what, trash is ugly, let's clean up the trash. And let's not allow immigrants into the country who are going to dirty the country. You know, there are things that are beautiful and there are things that are not beautiful. And it is, you know, beauty is a good thing. Beauty is a good thing. If you want to redefine this whole thing, you want to redefine beauty, I don't think that's done in good faith. I don't think it's done in good faith. I don't think the attempt to redefine beauty, to redefine trash as beautiful, I don't think that's a genuine attempt. I think that idea was created by people who deliberately wanted to mess with you. People who deliberately wanted to make you crazy and to make you useless. They came up with this idea like, oh, wouldn't it be a funny idea? Like, wouldn't it be just a civilizational prank if we started convincing a bunch of people that trash was beautiful and that big was beautiful? You know, being fat is beautiful and trash is beautiful and being ugly is beautiful and being disabled is beautiful. Wouldn't it be great if we played that prank on them? And if we paid a bunch of priests and a bunch of media personalities, if we paid them to go on the radio and the television and entertainment and to say just 24 hours a day, trash is beautiful, fat is beautiful, ugly is beautiful, weak is beautiful, disabled is beautiful. And if we can just get them to say that over and over and over again, maybe we can fool some really stupid, weak people into parroting that, and we can create this illusion that the majority of the people believe that ugly is beautiful. And then anyone who thinks otherwise is going to look around and be like, all these people are crazy, and if I speak out, I'm going to be harassed, I'm going to be hurt, financially, socially, maybe even physically. And so you create this scenario where you basically have a silent majority. A silent majority of people understand that the world is ugly. I mean, I talk to people who are very hedonistic, right? They do things, they have, you know, the druggy life and the sex-filled life because it feels good. And I ask them, how do you think about the universe? I mean, is the universe a good place to live? They'll say, the universe sucks, God doesn't exist, bad things happen to good people, and they have a very negative outlook. Whereas people who restrict themselves, who say, I'm not about hedonism, they tend to have a much better view of reality. They tend to be much more optimistic and think things like, hey, you know what, I think there's a universal God who loves everybody. So it's a very interesting thing that the people who are most obsessed with gaining short-term physical pleasures are the ones who also have the most negative metaphysical outlooks in terms of, you know, a divine creator or a benevolent creator, and the people who are most concerned with restricting their hedonistic pleasure in the short term are the ones who tend to believe most often that there is a benevolent, loving creator somewhere out there, or within them, you know, at all times. So, yeah, I tried to get to this question of humanization, and the question of humanization, again, to boil it down in the last analysis, the idea that we should humanize everyone equally is also the claim that we should evaluate all qualities of ourselves without discernment, without moral discernment. And so the moment that you say all people are equal is also the moment when you say all things within myself are equal. And that's the moment in which self-improvement becomes impossible. That's the moment in which betterment becomes impossible. And I don't know why this is so out of focus. That's unfortunate. But anyway, it's obvious that if I was king of the world and I wanted everyone else to become weak so that I could maintain power, I would push an ideology that says, never improve yourself. And the way I would achieve that ideology is that I would say everyone is equal. That is the doctrine. Everyone's equal, so never improve yourself, because the moment you improve yourself, you're admitting that some qualities are good and some qualities are bad. And if you do that, that's a slippery slope to saying that not all people are equal. So this whole question of dehumanization is actually dehumanizing, because from my perspective, the best quality of humanity is that we want to improve ourselves. That's the best. When I look at people and I see someone who's really not a good person, but I see them trying to improve themselves, and over time I see that progress, that's something that I see as beautiful. And probably the most beautiful thing about people is our ability and our striving to improve ourselves, to go from worse people to better people. And the ideology, this humanism and the humanizing of the elites, they use the term humanism and they use the term humanizing, but I think they actually take the most beautiful thing about people and they try to destroy it. They try to take the most beautiful thing, which is the desire for self-improvement, and they try to destroy it by saying that everyone's equal, and therefore if you ever say that this person's inferior to that person, then you're dehumanizing them. And if you dehumanize them, you're an evil person. You're basically Satan, and you need to be destroyed. You need to have your whole life destroyed. Your social life, your economic life, and maybe your physical life needs to be destroyed. So yeah, the whole semantics of humanization versus dehumanization, the ideology that calls itself humanistic, the ideology that says it's the humanizing ideology fighting against dehumanization, is actually the most dehumanizing ideology of all time. So again, you want to improve yourself, you want to discern, you want to judge, and you want to better yourself. That's about it. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.